welcome everyone. My name is Professor Martin Lackström from Xi'an Liverpool University, based in Suzhou. So usually when I mention my affiliation, I usually get one of two responses. So the first one is, see you next time, I'm in Xi'an. For the other response is, see you next time, I'm in Liverpool. We reside in neither, so we reside in Suzhou, as I just said. By the way, there's a typo in the program. It says that Xi'an Liverpool University is one of the co-authors, which is obviously not the case. So I'm the sole author of this paper. Right, the title is The Role of Supply Management for Sales and Operations Planning During the COVID-19 Pandemic. My presentation is a little bit, well, I wouldn't say the presentation is long, but the slide deck contains numerous slides. So I will pretty much just cherry pick the fun parts out of this presentation. So I might run through a little bit quick on some of the slides, but feel free to look up my paper and read all the details at the time of convenience. All right, I guess all of us have lived through the pandemic over the past few years to a more or less extent. So me as a resident in China, obviously to a larger extent. April and May of last year, I went through hard lockdown. So with Chinese standards, it means that you're not allowed to open the door of your apartment. You're not allowed to open the windows of your apartment. So forget about walking your dog, forget about bringing down the trash, forget about going to the supermarket buying groceries. How we survived is a different story. Happy to discuss that after my presentation. Anyway, the pandemic has caused a lot of supply chain disruptions. So here's a selection of headlines of affected industries. As you can see, I think most notably, the semiconductor, the chip components for the automotive industry. We heard from one of the keynote speeches earlier this morning how they had been affected. The presenter from Lisbon. We saw a shortage of toilet paper. Lo and behold, normally we think there's issue with like a high-tech components. Who could imagine that we would run out of toilet paper? McDonald's had a problem coping with beef supply shortage. Shortage of critical medical supplies in the beginning of the pandemic. There was a shortage of pretty much everything. It's like face masks and gloves, everything like that. Everyone in China became an exporter of medical equipment, including myself. Sending face masks all over the world, pretty much, which was in a dire shortage. N95 masks still in short supply. This is 1 year after the beginning of the pandemic. Potato shortage, temporary shortage. Yeah, the list can be made long. A few other cases in point. So so this is the reason why we had a toilet paper shortage. So we had this kind of opportunistic, hoarding behavior among people, among consumers. So some people end up with too much of stuff. Some other people, they get nothing, right? Port of LA, we had container vessels. I wouldn't say they're piling up, not literally, but they're waiting to offload their cargo due to shortage of truckers and port workers. And so as I said, at some points, supply chains are empty, and at other places, people are drowning in parcels. This photo is from Pudong Airport in Shanghai. So when it comes to air cargo, I think it's like 89% of all air cargo are actually shipped in the cargo bay of passenger aircraft, in the aircraft belly of passenger aircraft. So obviously when people stopped traveling, the passenger air traffic came to a screeching halt. There was not enough capacity to ship out air cargo. So pretty much everything got stuck at airports around the world. We also see here, how supply chains were affected. So this is a chart from IMF. They call it supply chain disruption index. So 100 is a maximum, and we could see that I think end of around beginning of 2020 was the peak of those supply chain disruptions. Apparently, Eurozone was the most heavily affected, followed by US, and then China and other emerging markets. We could also see that during the pandemic, this is a little bit dated, but the normal order fulfillment rate or service rate is 99%. And we could see that when the pandemic started, the service level dropped to 83%, and also persisted to be precipitously low for an extended period of time. I don't have more recent data, but pretty much throughout the entire pandemic, there has been problems with service levels across most industries. Still, in many industries, there are problems. So basically, the pandemic, it really brought global supply and demand out of whack. And companies are many times still struggling to rectify this. I think another thing which exacerbates the situation is the lack of supply chain transparency. We who teach supply chain management, we all know that end-to-end supply chain transparency is sort of the holy grail of supply chain management that we're all trying to seek and achieve. However, in reality, the situation is totally different, where this is a survey results from a McKinsey survey done in 2021, which shows that 11% of respondents have no transparency, supply chain transparency whatsoever. 48% they only have transparency reaching to their tier 1 suppliers, 21% to their tier 2 suppliers. Only 2% have transparency to their third tier suppliers. So if anything happened, in the second or third tier, it's one thing, pretty decent transparency with tier 1 suppliers, but if anything happened with the second or third tier suppliers, that will have ripple effects downstream the supply chain and eventually, hit your own operations. So that is still an issue. So we're still far from end-to-end supply chain transparency. We haven't found the holy grail yet. So the problem here is that we can conclude that supply chains were severely impacted by the pandemic, particularly severe in some industries like automotive. And the question here is what companies should do in order to mitigate the negative impact, or you could say, what should they do in order to mitigate these problems in the future, or what could they have done differently to mitigate these problems? And it's also clear that companies that pay more attention to supply risks also experience less supply chain disruptions during the pandemic. One case in point here is Toyota, which implemented an early warning system already after the Tohoku earthquake back in 2015, related to the Fukushima nuclear disaster. So they were severely affected already back then, and they already took precautionary measures or corrective action to mitigate such future events. So they set up actually a supply early warning system in order to detect upstream supply chain problems early on. And by the way, I've written a teaching case on this particular topic. It's available from the Case Center in the UK, for those of you who are interested. So there seems to be, if we, in the industry and academia, we talk a lot about, demand forecasting, right? It's kind of a household term, right? We're all throwing around, both academia and practice. However, how many of you have heard about the term supply forecasting? Hands up. Supply forecasting. Okay, 1, 2. Not too many of you. So it's used to a relatively much less extent, right? And this is also corroborated if you do a simple Google trend search on those two terms, supply forecasting versus demand forecasting. Then we can conclude that the term demand forecasting is searched for to 3 to 4 times higher extent than the term supply forecasting. So if you think about it, right, supply chain management is about managing supply and demand, or balancing supply and demand, right? So why should we then only do demand forecasting? Why shouldn't we do supply forecasting, right? In order to give us a better ability to act more proactively on the supply side of our company. So that's kind of the whole the conundrum here. Sort of mulling over, why is this the case? Why haven't companies been more better prepared? Why haven't they been able to cope with this situation? So maybe there is something related to supply side activities that have brought companies into this melee. Right, so in terms of problem definition, I think this justifies further investigation about the importance of supply management for effective supply chain management. And based on our observations, it appears that supply management is underemphasized compared to demand management, at least for the past decade. And even this trend has diverged. So it's not like there's a massive pickup in interest for supply forecasting amidst the pandemic or in the wake of the pandemic, but this seems to have persisted even. So the question is, have companies really paid attention to this? Do they understand the importance of proper supply management in order to manage your overall supply chain effectively? So this is also one of the general observations here, and it's also, I think, it's testimony to the kind of reactive approaches that companies take when it comes to supply management. Okay. So research objective here is to examine and test existing theory related to sales and operations planning. So the reason why I decided to use this framework is because it's kind of a de facto standard tool that many companies are applying in their businesses. So I mean, alternative frameworks could be like the SCORE framework and so on and so forth. So if you come to a point where you have to make kind of a decision, I think there's not that much academic research related to the SCORE framework. So that's also one of the reasons why I decided to pick the S&OP framework here. More specifically, the paper in question here attempts to answer following research questions, namely, what are the antecedents to sales operations planning performance? How does S&OP influence business performance, and what role does supply management play in the context of S&OP? And this is basically the framework that was applied in this paper. It's based on a meta-analysis from some 270 papers on the topic, something like that. It's by Tunis, Scavarda, Fernandez, and Scavarda from 2012. So interestingly here, you have, in terms of the outcomes, you look at marketing, sales, and supply management activities is kind of like baked into operations here. It's not even treated as a standalone function, so to speak. So that again shows that in literature it's also under emphasized, at least in my view. Okay, so some derivation of hypothesis. I'm not going to go through the rationale for the sake of time here. I'm just going to state them one by one. For the derivation of the hypothesis, you can just read by yourself. But the first set of hypotheses, we hypothesize that sales operations planning has a positive impact on strategic performance and on financial performance. You can also read in the paper how these were operationalized, but long story short, strategic performance was operationalized as a market share and sales growth, and financial performance, we operationalized that as return on assets and return on sales. Hypothesis 2A, here we hypothesize that supply chain organization has a positive impact on sales and operations planning. So with supply chain organization, we basically refer to, do you have formal S&OP teams? Do you have planning processes? How do you conduct your teamwork, etc., etc. Hypothesis 2B, supply chain information management has a positive impact on sales and operations planning. So the way that you share and communicate, share information, and communicate internally, but also with your supply chain partners, both the supply and demand side. And hypothesis 2C, here we hypothesize, going back to the very rationale of this research, that supply management has a positive impact on sales and operations planning performance. And then the final set of hypotheses, we basically also tie that back to leadership. I think also, Dave Harry, talked a lot about, the importance of leadership, when it comes to quality management. So I think also in pretty much any business context, leadership plays a crucial role, and it's kind of the primordial capability of any organization. Like, no matter what you're undertaking, it basically starts and ends with leadership. So we hypothesize that leadership has a positive influence on supply chain organization, supply chain information management, and also supply management activities. And with these hypotheses, we form a research framework looking like this. With the hypothesis here printed out. And to test this framework, we did a quantitative survey. Population size 1,308 participants, done by email. 286 invitations bounced back, 143 completed surveys, 47 partially filled out, 96 usable questionnaires, and after some follow-up calls, we got another 34. In the end, 130 usable questionnaires corresponding to 12.7% response rate. Survey demographics, you can see quite a broad range of industries here. Majority related to energy, resources, and material, followed by automotive, food and agriculture, financial services, and so on and so forth. 90% of the respondents were foreign MNEs with operations in China. The headquarters of the participants were evenly distributed across the 3 geographic regions, EMEA, Americas, and APAC. And also here on the right-hand side, you can see the respondent seniority. So pretty much all of them were, at upper or senior management levels. Also sample demographics here in terms of the country where the headquarters is located, and also some details about the industry representation. Here's a very lengthy, crammed slide with the operationalization of the constructs. Again, I'm not going to read that out loud because I guess we want to finish before midnight, right? Again, it's in my paper, so you can read about operationalization here. But basically, a long story short, we use reflective measures for those of you who are interested in that. Then a principal component analysis was conducted, and you can see it turned out pretty nicely here, where we basically see that the construct items were loading significantly onto each of those principal components you can see here. A total of 7 to the number. So we use principal axis factoring with equal-max with Kaiser normalization as rotation method, convergence in 13 iterations. Reliability analysis, Cronbach's alpha above 0.7, composite reliability above 0.7, factor loadings above 0.5, construct item loading statistically significant, and average variance extracted about 0.5 as well. So these fulfill the reliability criteria by margin. Validity analysis. So here we can see that the correlation matrix showed that square root of average variance extracted was greater than the off-diagonal values, except for one, this one here. SOP versus leadership. But the difference was not big enough to warrant any sort of bigger concern in that sense. Then we tested the path coefficients by using partial least squares analysis. For that purpose, we used a software called Smart PLS, free to use unless you have very large samples. So it's a type of structural equation modeling. For those of you who didn't already know that. Long story short here, we can see that all the path coefficients were significant, at least on the 5% level, some of them even on 1% or even 0.1% level. And that gives us the final result in terms of testing the research model. And I think what's interesting to highlight here is that the path from supply management activities to sales operations planning performance was significant and also very strong, so 0.42 here. So that means that the corresponding hypothesis was accepted. So some conclusions from a theoretical point of view, we can see that this study supports hypothesized causal linkages in terms of the constructs that were defined. They were also in line with expectations as well. So all hypotheses were finally accepted with adequate significance levels. And also we can say that the outcome provides insights into causes and effects under highly rare and idiosyncratic conditions in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. Managerial implications, I think we can conclude that pretty much every company around the world has been affected by the pandemic. I think we can also conclude that one of the reasons why companies were so badly affected is that the decade leading up to the pandemic has been characterized by relatively high both economic and political stability in the world. And this has led to sort of say the emergence of these philosophies, like lean management, lean operations, zero inventory policies, and so on and so forth. So in that process, assuming that history is a predictor of the future, I would say gone a little bit too far and trimmed their supply chains. It's basically like a supply chain liposuction, right? You look beautiful, but once you get sick, you don't have any excess reserves, to mitigate, a period of disease, right? So it's the same thing here. So I think we can conclude that lean itself is not a panacea. And lean is not ideal under all conditions. It's good during stable periods, but when you have periods of volatility, it's probably not the right approach here. So I think going forward, what companies need to do is to become better at forecasting the environment. Not only on the demand side, also on the supply side, and take actions proactively. I think what most people, and by extension most companies, assumed in the beginning of the pandemic is that this is just another flu, right? We heard a lot of talk around this, just another flu. Let's wait until next week. Let's wait until next month, next quarter, okay, next year. And then 3 years into the pandemic, here we are, everyone, waiting and hoping for the pandemic to wane, which took way longer than I think any one of us could imagine. So I think companies, they need to build this kind of higher order capability to transfer, to change between a lean and agile supply chain. So I think when you look at this, like Howley's supply chain design framework, where you have a matrix with 4 quadrants based on supply and demand uncertainty. That kind of assumes that situation environment is static, right? And assumes that once you're lean, you're always lean, right? Which is not the case, because over longer periods of time, supply and demand uncertainty will change. It will vary over time. So we need to have the ability to continuously reconfigure our supply chains in order to ensure that there's a fit between our own organization and the external environment. And that, by the way, is the only survival ability we need as a company. It's the ability to adapt to changing environment. So I think also, let's say from a basic inventory management point of view, we need to go from this kind of notion that inventory must be minimized to a philosophy of optimizing inventory. It's not about minimizing inventory, it's about optimizing inventory. And during periods of stability, optimizing means minimizing inventory. But at other times, it might or probably means that we need to increase our inventory levels, our safety stock, and so on and so forth, proactively in order to cope with supply and demand uncertainty. I think other conclusions probably, companies, they have probably over-relied on China as a sourcing market. So usually when companies say, we pursue global sourcing, and then when you look a little bit further under the hood, you realize that, companies, they do 90 or 99% of the sourcing out of China. So China sourcing has become synonymous with global sourcing simply because you can find pretty much everything you need in a place like China. So I think this is why we see new concepts emerging, like companies talk about de-risking their supply chain, not putting all eggs in one basket, China plus one. So you still do the bulk of your sourcing from China, but you add another country like Vietnam or Malaysia or India, something like that. Okay? So I think companies, need to diversify their supply bases, conduct periodic assessment, both in terms of your internal environment and the external environment, to ensure that there's a fit between the two. And companies should become more forward-looking as well, to take a more proactive rather than reactive approach to the way that they're managing their supply chains. And with that, I thank you for your attention and happy to receive your comments and questions. Thank you.
Just really quickly before we take questions, just for my sake of knowledge, and it might help other people in the room. Can you clarify your independent and dependent variable, and did you consider mediating variables? In other words, what I'm asking is, it seemed like on one of your conclusions, the first conclusion slide, you seem to, not that one, the one, oh yeah, I know that's important, but can I look at your conclusion slide just really quickly? Because the first conclusion slide, the short, that one, the theoretical implications. You say, maybe I'm just getting this wrong in my own thinking, so I apologize if that's the case.
No problem.
Because you say, in terms of the effects, you're looking at the effects on business performance. So business performance is your dependent variable, is that right?
Yeah.
And then planning is your independent variable, would you say? Planning.
Well, I mean, this is structural equation modeling, so we have multiple stages here. So I mean, basically, this, you could say that this is a mediating, variable in a sense. This is also, mediating variable between, let's say, leadership and S&OP performance. So I mean, it depends on how you look at it. But this is basically a multi-stage structural equation modeling.
Like leadership leading to better planning, leading to better performance.
Information management and better supply management that leads to better sales and operations planning, and that in turn leads to improved strategic and financial performance.
And I'm sorry, I'm indulging a bit here. And I really liked your presentation. I should have said that the first thing. Sorry, that was it. I should have said that because it was very good.
Okay,
I feel like the model that you created is highly complex, and probably a lot of people in this room, at least myself, has a lot to learn from your methodology. It's very good. But I just want to make sure, and I'm asking, I don't know, I'm just thinking it's almost like the so what question. I'm thinking, don't we know that good planning leads to better performance? Don't we know that good leadership is about planning? I mean, is your data and all of this complex data which you've done is just telling us something like good planning leads to good results, or good leadership leads to good planning?
I mean, this has been investigated, to more or less extent in various configurations over time. As I said, this, let's go back to here. This, sorry, so I'm scrolling here. This framework here, this S&OP framework, as I said, this one. I mean, it's based on a meta-analysis. I think it was like 270 papers, something like that. So yes, it has been researched. I think what makes it more novel is the stronger emphasis on the role of supply management, because that has not been widely covered in the past. The literature shows that there's basically two papers addressing the role of supply management at all. One was made based on a survey, and then there's another one, I think it's a single case study, basically. So that is not very widely researched. Then I think also relates to the data set, to conduct this research during a highly volatile period of time, whereas other research, the prior 10 to 15 years have pretty much been done, during a period of very high economic political stability. And I think that then you get probably quite different results as well. So if you would do that in the decade leading up to the pandemic, you would probably see the academic research speaking in favor of lean, as if it would be panacea that you should always apply, because there has been very little research done on that topic during periods of very, very high uncertainty, demand and supply uncertainty. So I think that itself also contrasts prior research, which speaks strongly in favor of lean. So I would say lean is good, but again, not always, not under every circumstance, not in every situation.
And just a quick follow-up, which is, would you say your research is more significant for during times of pandemic or crises, or do you say from your research you can make conclusions about times of stability, I think is what you mentioned. In other words, how from your research can you make conclusions about times of stability if you're studying during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I think if you contrast this research with research that has been done during a period of stability, then you can see, okay, this is the situation, how you should act and behave, during periods of uncertainty. So I think in that sense, it adds value because you have very different data sets which were collected during under radically different conditions. I think that is one additional takeaway from.
Sorry for this interruption. I think I hope it's a positive interruption. You guys talk about the data connection. In one slide, you showed a trend, supply and demand imbalance. The timeline is 2004 to 2012. 22. It makes sense during the COVID 2019, yes, to 2022. So what is this background? How is it linked to the research topic? Why we need to go back and look at 2004?
It's basically to show the trend. So my thought, like before I did this, I thought, I don't hear a lot of people talking about supply forecasting, right? So I thought, but probably people should pay more attention to it during the pandemic, right? So when I did this, before I did it, I thought there would be like a sharp increase in the interest for supply forecasting during the pandemic, right? But it didn't happen. There's like very little change in the trend, and it just increased the interest for demand forecasting. So I thought this one would kind of like catch up, but it hadn't. So for me, it's an indicator that there is an underemphasis on supply management in this context.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed, it makes sense. You look at the because the research topic is touched with COVID, so it makes sense. Look at the past 3 to 5 years. But in terms of this figure, you want to discuss about supply and demand, the trends. Look at the past 70 years is also rationale. I just try to understand what is your justification. You look at these past 17 years, rather 15 years or 10 years. What is kind of big events we missing in this research? So.
Well, I mean, I think the COVID-19 pandemic is probably knock on wood, once in a lifetime kind of event, at par with World War. I think that's the only kind of event that eclipses COVID-19 pandemic, basically. I mean, I wish I could go back even farther in time, but Google Trends only allow me to go back until 2004. That's why it's.
Okay. I know some city. Actually, this is a very good trend. Given holistic overview. It's just because I try to focus more on your topic, because I guess all our research scope, the data should be very pertinent to the research scope, because your research title is linked specific to this outbreak time period.
Right.
I imagine it should somehow make sense. We focus more on those kind of data. It's just my personal understanding. Perhaps I'm
no. For me, the reason. I mean, if I would only show data like from here, end of 2019, it's. I think that wouldn't really give the whole picture, right? So I want to go further back and see if there was any trend shift at the point of time when the pandemic started, which is not. So this is more like for the sake of a trend analysis rather than only do a small snapshot during the pandemic.
Of course. Sorry, Chair. Do I still have one more small quick question? Sorry. Because I believe I should leave questions for other audience, and this is very exciting. And I do statistics, I do quantitative You mentioned about the the contracts indicators and then alpha and also coefficient and I say T statistics. I imagine your team must use SPS sort of statistic tool. And but of course you mentioned about the smart PLS.
Yeah.
My simple question is that this data you collect from the secondary relevant data or primary data. For instance, by survey, questionnaire,
email.
and then you use the
email survey.
Okay, like
that we
maybe
send out to managers, senior managers of foreign multinationals with operations in China.
Yeah, just like your model is very complicated. I believe lots of things I'm going to learn. I just stop here. Hope after this session I can send email, can have informally chat. I mean, some of the indicators. I see your conclusion, lots of lists there. Some I feel is somehow out of my knowledge at this stage, but I prefer leave the time to other audience. Thank you very much.
Feel free. Yeah, my email is in the header of the paper, which is published for this conference. Yeah,
Thank you.
Feel free. Reach out.
Thank you.
And anyone else of you as well, for that matter.
Yeah, please.
Oh, okay. One more technical question. Could you go to the table of your correlations, please? Yeah, you have the previous one. Sorry, where you present the correlations. The previous one, sorry. That 95. So, okay, you have a correlation of 95%, 0.95 between SOP and leadership. Okay, don't you think that is a little bit over the
path coefficient? Yeah.
Is that a path coefficient or is that correlation?
Sorry, it's correlation. Yeah.
Okay, when you have correlation, I know that we should be careful in interpretation, but when you have correlations of that magnitude, I would consider that we have an issue here of validity, don't you?
Well, again, we
because you almost okay. We have to be careful in the way those rules of thumb.
So again, we simply apply this kind of criterion as stipulated by Holland, Chow, and Lam. So it's basically statistical kind of standard criteria applied in this type of research.
Okay, I'm familiar with this kind of research, but when you are speaking, but one thing is it is when you have correlations of 0.5, okay, and you compare the AVEs and but you have a correlation of 0.95. It is all they are almost perfectly correlated.
Yeah.
So I imagine that you have used smart PLS because in Amos probably you have.
Yeah, I mean, of course. If you use structural equation modeling like Amos, you have much higher requirements in terms of normal distribution of the data. You need a larger sample typically as well. Also, you need to be non-collinearity and so on and so forth. So the requirements for applying like Amos are much higher. So that's why PLS is generally recommended, like when you have smaller data sizes and when you not necessarily have normal data, which is often not the case when you do this kind of surveys where you have like a 5-grade scale, for instance. You rarely get like a nice normal distribution.
I feel your pain. Let me put this way, okay? But my question is there. 0.95 to accept that as to accept that for a validity test analysis. It is.
Yeah, I think probably what you're hinting at, it might be a case of, let's say, tautology, in the sense that you have two factors that are like conceptually very similar to one another. So
you can remove one.
You can remove.
Because they are calculating the same thing.
Yeah.
But
it's a very valid point. Yeah.
You didn't consider here the reverse causality, for example. So, but If I was
Yeah,
doing
and
that
this
analysis,
is a general challenge when you do this kind of modeling, because you might even have, let's say, bidirectional
Yeah.
causality even, and
Multiple linearity.
yeah. So it's not entirely trivial. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, but it's a fair point, so I appreciate it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We've gone a bit over and we have
Sure.
two other presenters, but are there any burning questions that I wouldn't want to silence anyone, but I just want to thank you for answering everyone's questions. I think
Sure.
out of everyone, you had to answer more questions than everyone, but
Yeah.
it's a fault of probably the methodology you used, which is, again, it causes us all to think a lot and
Sure.
want to ask questions.
No, I think that's why we're all here, right? Yeah,
That's
I
right.
appreciate it.
So thank you very
All
much.
right, thank you.